pie chart is total federal spending for last year. And it's a good way of looking at where does all our tax money go. These two breakout slices of the pie, the green and the orange slice, are what we call discretionary spending. That's 39% of the budget. That's defense, and that's all the domestic government agencies. The domestic discretionary slice of the pie grew about 24% in the last 2 years, and 84% when you add stimulus to it. Now, that is what Congress does control. That's what Congress, on an annual basis, literally sets the spending levels for that category of spending. The other 61% of the slice of the pie is not what Congress controls on an annual basis. That's called mandatory spending, or it's autopilot spending. It occurs automatically. So when you hear about Congress, passing appropriation bills and things like this, that is just this other 39% of the pie. These programs are automatic. Congress doesn't control them every year. And there are things that are automatic, meaning if you qualify for a benefit, you automatically get it. We pay our interest payments on our debt. If you're a veteran, you get veterans benefits. If you're a farmer, you get farm program payments. If you're 65, you get Medicare and Social Security. Those are automatic benefits, and that's the category of spending in our government that's growing the fastest. Now, there's a few reasons why, and the biggest drivers of our future debt are the big, what we call entitlement programs, or mandatory spending programs. Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. Now, right now, Social Security in this year is the biggest program. Medicaid and Medicare are smaller programs. But Social Security does not grow tremendously like the others do in the years ahead. These are all the big drivers of our debt. But look how much Medicare grows and Medicaid grows over time. They grow tremendously, to the point where these three programs alone, along with the interest on our debt, consume every penny of federal revenue by the year 2025. And literally, those programs and the interest take up all the fiscal space, every penny of every federal tax coming in, and that leaves no room for anything else. That just shows you a sense of why and how they're the contributors of our debt in the future. Now, why is it that these programs, particularly these healthcare entitlement programs, are growing so fast? Well, there's a few reasons why. Number one, when Medicare and Medicaid were created in the mid-'60s, baby boomers were babies and teenagers. Now they're seniors. And so we're going from 40 million retirees to 77 million retirees. But these are what you call pay-as-you-go programs. What that means is current workers pay their current taxes to finance the benefits for current beneficiaries. I pay my payroll taxes to finance my mom's Medicare and Social Security benefits. That works out fine if your demographics are stable, but they're not in this case. We have a 100% increase in the retirement population, but only a corresponding 17% increase in the tax-paying population. For all of those of you who had kids in your 50s and in the 50s and 60s, you did a great job. You had a whole bunch of them. But we haven't had as many since then. So the problem is, from a demographic sense, doubling the amount of retirees, but not doubling the amount of taxpayers for those programs. Another interesting factor is longevity. When these programs were created, men lived into their 60s and women lived into their 70s. Now men are living into their 70s and women are living in their 80s and in their 90s. It's a good thing. But it wasn't projected. It wasn't foreseen. It wasn't anticipated when these programs were created. A third factor is healthcare costs, or healthcare inflation. It grows a lot faster than our economy grows. It grows a lot faster than all other prices grow. And so it is those combination of factors that are the reason why these programs are growing so fast, why these programs are going bankrupt. And so when you take a look at debt and why our debt is growing so much, there are a few things you need to take into account when it comes to our debt. And it's not that different than a person's debt. We all have debt. You have debt when you get a mortgage to buy a house, you get a car loan, a small business loan. What matters with your debt for a person and a country is how big is your debt relative to your income. You only get so much mortgage based on how much money you make, so you can pay for your mortgage. It also matters is who are you borrowing the money from? Who do you owe it back to? Well, in 1970, our debt wasn't that big, and 95% of our debt was basically Americans buying treasury bills. 5% of our debt was by foreigners. Our debt grew, and in 1990, 81% of our debt was owned by other Americans, and 19% was owned by foreigners. Today, our debt is a whole lot bigger, And 47% of our debt is owned by foreigners, by foreign countries. China being number one, Japan being number two. Here's the problem. For every dollar that the federal government spends today, 42 cents of that dollar is borrowed. Half of that is borrowed from other countries. You can't keep doing this. We can't keep having a situation in which almost half of our borrowing comes from other countries. We are basically relying on other governments to cash flow our government. And what that ends up doing is it ends up compromising our independence, losing our sovereignty and our ability to control our own fate and our own future. And we're relying on other countries that don't necessarily have our best interest in mind with respect to our government. So that is one very important critical factor to keep in mind as we look at what's going on with our debt. Now, as I mentioned, we're used to debt. We have it ourselves as individuals. Our countries had it in the past. In World War II, our debt, as you can see here, I don't know if this podium's in your way. I'll just verbalize it. World War II, our debt was as big as our economy, meaning for every dollar made and produced in America, we borrowed that much to win World War II. Now, in that time, we basically sold war bonds, and people sort of lent the money to the government. But after World War II, our borrowing went back down to fairly normal levels. And what economists tell us is, if your debt gets as high as 60% of your economy, meaning if the level of borrowing is 60% of the entire size of your economy, you're kind of getting into the dangerous zone. We're a little over 70% right now. If you get to 90% of the economy, that's what the economists tell us is when your economy really starts shutting down. It really starts slowing down. You're not growing very fast, if at all. You're losing jobs. Well, this is what the Congressional Budget Office tells us our debt is going to become. This is the current law path we are on. These aren't my numbers, these are the government's numbers. And this tells us that our debt is getting so high, it's eclipsing in just by the end of this decade where we were in World War II and going way beyond that. This is unsustainable. You can't do this. I mean, it's literally mathematically not possible. What the CBO tells us, the Congressional Budget Office tells us, is by the year 2037, their economic model that forecasts the economy going forward crashes. And they just can't conceive of a way in which the U.S. economy can continue past that point because of debt. Jan and I live in Janesville. We've got 3 kids who are 6, 7, and 9. When our 3 kids are my age, the debt will be 2 to 3 times the size of our economy. So for every dollar that is made in America, by everyone in America, the government is slated to borrow 2 or 3 at that time. It's just not a sustainable situation. The other issue is time is of the essence. The sooner we recognize this problem, the sooner we get on top of this problem and solve this problem, the better off everybody's going to be. Because every year we keep digging this hole much, much deeper. This is what we call the fiscal gap. And it is a calculation that is made by the General Accountability Office. The General Accountability Office is the auditing arm of Congress. And what they're telling us is this. 2 years ago in 2009, our fiscal gap, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, was $62.9 trillion. What that basically means is, this is the amount of unfunded promises the government is making to today's Americans. So look at this room. You've got seniors, you've got workers, and you've got children. You know, my mom's generation, my kids' generation. Those 3 generations have promises that are being made to them by our government that right now the government is shy of being able to fund by the tune of, in 2009, $62.9 trillion. In 2010, that number, oops, I just hit the wrong thing here, excuse me. In 2010, I do that all the time. In 2010, that number went up to $76.4 trillion. This year, from last year, it went up to $99.4 trillion. Okay. How do you get your mind around these kinds of numbers? $99.4 trillion. Our economy produces about $14 trillion a year right now. What this means is, if we want our government to keep the promises it is making to today's Americans, we'd have to come up with $99.4 trillion today, invest in a treasury race, so that we can have it to actually pay all the benefits and all the promises that the government's making today. That just shows you how out of whack our system is. How many promises that are empty and unfunded that government's making to people. And the point is, we keep getting deeper in the hole, because every year we keep delaying fixing this problem. There's another year more boomers go into retirement, fewer workers come behind them into the workplace, healthcare inflation grows, and on and on and on the problem gets. And so that is why the sooner we deal with this problem, the better. And that is why we offered a very bold budget. That is why we decided we need to see this problem and head it off at the pass. And so this is what we're proposing. And there's basically 4 objectives with our budget. Number 1, it goes without saying, but it's worth repeating, grow the economy, create jobs. So we propose a lot of things to create jobs. Number 1, we think we should have an energy policy that drills for oil and gas in our own country, helps reduce the supply, helps increase the supply and reduce the price and get our dependence off of foreign oil and create jobs here today. Number 2, we also propose pro-growth tax reform. I'll get into this more in the detail, but we're basically saying, like President Obama's Bipartisan Fiscal Commission recommended, clear out a lot of the loopholes and the tax shelters so we can lower tax rates across the board for everybody, businesses and individuals alike, so we can have a flatter, fairer, simpler tax system that is more internationally competitive to help us thrive and compete in the international economy and simplify the tax system because it's so complicated. Number 2, strengthen the social safety net. What do I mean when I say that? In the 1990s, people often think of welfare reform as having been completed. Well, welfare reform, which was very successful in the 90s, reformed basically one program. There are dozens others from the federal government that were not reformed. And so what we're saying is get the safety net in a sustainable position. It's right now growing at unsustainable rates. These programs are facing bankruptcy. And retool them so they work for the 21st century to help people get new jobs, get job training, to get careers that put them back on their feet. Meaning we want a safety net that is geared not toward keeping people on welfare, but geared toward getting able-bodied people back on their feet and into lives of self-sufficiency. Number 2, this also goes without saying, fulfill the mission of health and retirement security. I think we've also reached consensus, just like we've reached consensus, we had to have a safety net to help people who can't help themselves, to help people who are down on their luck, or to get people back on their feet. We also have consensus to have health and retirement security. But as I just mentioned a minute ago, those programs themselves are going bankrupt. Those programs themselves are growing at such a pace that there's no way they can be fully funded if they stay on the status quo. So I'll talk more about that in a moment, but we've got to address that, and the sooner we do it, the better off everybody's going to be. And the last thing, again, this kind of goes without saying, is pay off our debt. And we basically give our children a debt-free country. Right now, we are taking from them. We are borrowing from their future. Our government, through all of its overspending, all of its printing, is basically doing so at the expense of the next generation. We've never had a situation in this country where one generation lives at the expense of the next. It's usually each generation addresses its challenges in front of it so the next one's better off. So as corny as this may seem, we basically say, get us on a plan to pay off the national debt, just like you do with your mortgage. Get a payment plan in place to get your debt paid off over time. And that's precisely what we propose to do. So here's basically what it looks like. Instead of the president's budget, which keeps our spending right now is that as high as it ever has been since World War II. He keeps spending up at those elevated levels and then keeps it continuing on. We propose to bring spending back down to where it historically has been, and that saves us about $6.2 trillion in spending off of his budget. Now, as I showed you before, or mentioned before, our history of spending in the past has been relatively consistent. We have basically taken about 20 cents out of every dollar made in America, 20% of our economy, to spend on the federal government. This is what the Congressional Budget Office says we're about to do. The path we are on right now not only has us going up at these elevated levels that we've never been since World War II, but surpassing that, to the point where when my kids are my age, the size of our government will be double for them at that time than what it is for us at this time. And that is a dangerous precedence where you would have to not only double the taxes on Americans today, you would have a double the size of government. And then it goes up from there. Here's what our plan does. It basically says, get spending back down to where it has historically been and keep it there. Look at what the Congressional Budget Office is telling us about deficits. We've had deficits before. We even had some small surpluses for a period of time. This is what they're telling us our deficits are looking like. Our deficits literally go in a downward tailspin if we don't do something about this. This is the path we're on right now. What we're proposing is to get us back on a path to balance, run surpluses so we can literally pay off our debt. This is sort of the fork in the road we're at right now. Are we going to get our spending and deficits under control, or are we going to go down the present path and just watch this thing get out of our control? At the end of the day, this is basically the choice of two futures we have in front of us. this crushing burden or tidal wave of debt that's coming, or this kind of a plan what we're proposing. This is what the CBO says our plan achieves. The debt peaks in 2 years as a share of our economy. It never gets close to that 90% tipping point, and then it goes down from there on after to the point where we actually do pay off the debt for the next generation. That is basically what we're trying to achieve here, is get in place a plan to get government to live within its means, get government on a path to stop spending money it doesn't have, and then start paying off our debt so the next generation has a debt-free country. Now, there are so many other things I could talk about. I'll just talk about a couple. One is Medicare. As I mentioned, Medicare is not the biggest program today in the federal government, but it soon becomes that because of the factors I mentioned. And I want to ask a question. How many of you are 55 years old or older? This plan does not change Medicare benefits for any of you who just raised your hand. I know there's been TV ads and phone calls and all that sort of thing. What we're saying is this. If you've already retired, or if you're about to retire, meaning 55 and above, you already organize your lives around these programs. I mean, you're already banking on these things. Government's made these promises to you, and you're already there at the stage where you're redeeming those promises. Our point is, if we fix this now, government can keep those promises. We want government to keep those promises, so we're proposing to make no changes in Medicare for a person who's 55 and above. But to be able to do that, we have to address its looming insolvency, the fact that it's going insolvent in 9 years, and fix it for the next generation. And the way in which we propose to fix it for the next generation, for the under 55-year-olds, when they turn 65, is to move it to work like a plan like the one that we have in Congress, like federal employees. It's not a voucher. A voucher is money goes to you, and then you go off into the marketplace and buy something. It's called premium support. That's how it works for federal employees. We get a book. We get a range of plans to pick from. You know, I got Humana, Blue Cross, I've got Aetna, I've got Dean, and then we pick our plan, and then the government, our employer, subsidizes those premiums. That's the same way it would work with this. It would work like the prescription drug benefit works today for seniors, or like Medigap insurance or supplemental insurance works, or like Medicare Advantage works. So we already have lots of examples of seniors having plans to pick from for their business. And the reason we chose to do it this way is we want to put the senior in charge. We want to put that future senior, that 54 and below year old, who is facing an insolvent Medicare system that's going bankrupt on the status quo. We want to preserve the system. We want to make it solvent so it's something that they can actually count on when they get it. And it's not as if these ideas are new ideas. This specific kind of plan was what was proposed by President Clinton's bipartisan commission to save Medicare. It hinges off the ideas like our prescription drug benefit works today. One of the lessons we learned from the prescription drug benefit was by giving seniors more choices, but more importantly, having multiple plans from which they get to choose from, and having those plans compete against each other for their business, it actually saves money. Saves money for the senior, saves money by lowering their premiums, saves money for the government. And so this is a government program, the prescription drug program, which actually, we thought it was going to cost this much, it ended up costing that much, it came in 41% below costs. I mean, name me another government program that was created that came in 41% below what the government thought it was going to cost. There really isn't any. So Jim Harris, you would know the answer to that question if it was. So the point we're trying to say is, learn from good lessons we've learned from. Give the seniors the choices, have the plans compete against each other for their business, and the way in which we propose to subsidize their plans is basically this. When the new program in 2022 would start, it would give the average senior the average per Medicare beneficiary subsidy that they would have at that time under the traditional program. But if you're a wealthy person, don't give them as much of a subsidy, and give more to low-income and middle-income seniors, and more to people whose healthcare risks go up. So basically, it's those with less get more, and those with more get less. Doing it this way makes this program solvent and sustainable. It has complete out-of-pocket coverage for low-income seniors and people with high healthcare risks. But more to the point, it gives us the ability of getting Medicare solvent in preventing bankruptcy, and it gives us the further ability of guaranteeing the current program as it's currently designed is intact without changes for people 55 and above.